Hi, good afternoon, and welcome to day 3 of our webinar series. My name is Leslie Wolf. I'm InterDrone's conference producer, and I'd like to thank you all so much for joining us today. Today's topic is a very timely one. Our speaker, Michelle, will be talking about pandemics and privacy. So before we get started, I've just got a couple of quick housekeeping notes. So in terms of the audio, this is being broadcast over the internet. You'll want to make sure that your audio is unmuted, it's turned up. Any audio issues should be able to be solved by clicking on the little question mark at the top of your screen. But if that doesn't fix it, we sometimes find that clicking out of the webinar and then clicking back in can solve your problem. Questions. So we definitely want to encourage you to ask questions throughout. They will likely be answered at the end during the Q&A portion. But in order to submit, just go to the Ask a Question box at the bottom of your screen. You can type in there. Any sort of technical issues that you're having, you can also type into the box there, and we have staff ready and able to answer your questions. All right, so our speaker, Michelle, is the co-director of the Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Mississippi School of Law. And so with that, Michelle, I'll pass it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thank you very much, Leslie. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I think, as Leslie said, this is a very timely topic because we want to talk about pandemics and the utilization of drones in this time of COVID and this time of pandemic. My research team at the University of Mississippi School of Law and I think this is a really opportune time to be thinking about how we can use drones in the future. I think it's been a great wake-up call for communities and the public to understand what drones can actually do. And I think this is, as opportunistic as it may sound, there are some good things that have come out of this pandemic, other than, people, the community coming together as a community to help neighbors. It's also an opportunity to chase innovation and actually use technology to help people in ways that we've never, ever experienced before. So I want to take you back to my neck of the woods. This is a picture of Westport, Connecticut, which is a suburb of New York City. I want to take you back to March 5th, 2020. So just before all hell broke loose. In Westport, now this is just a picture of Westport. I don't know which house this happened in, but about 50 guests gathered to celebrate a 40th birthday. They hailed from all around the United States, and at least one guest had traveled from Johannesburg, South Africa. They shared memories, a lavish buffet, and, unknown to anyone at the time, the coronavirus. Then they scattered. The Westport soiree was party zero in southwestern Connecticut and beyond. The partygoers, more than half of whom were infected, left that evening for Johannesburg, New York City, and other parts of Connecticut and the United States, all seeding infections along the way. Westport, a town of 28,000 people, did not have a single known case of the coronavirus on the day of the party. Just 11 days later, it had 85. Westport, with less than 1% of Connecticut state's population, made up 1/5 of the state's infections. The governor called Fairfield County, which includes Westport, a hotspot, not too surprising as it shares a train line with New Rochelle, New York, the home of New York's patient zero. Westport and county were largely considered the epicenter of Connecticut's COVID crisis. By April 21, Westport had 197 confirmed cases. In fact, the week of April 20, Fairfield County was averaging 1,500 to 2,000 new cases per day. That's big. It's no wonder that Westport's first selectman, Jim Marp, and the Westport police were eager to implement the Flatten the Curve pilot program, prepared by the drone company Dragonfly, a program that promised to effectively monitor social distancing, ease the spread of COVID-19, and keep the Westport community and police personnel safe. Westport announced its intent to implement the Flatten the Curve pilot program on the 21st of April. According to the police chief, Kus Knas, quote, using drones remains a go-to technology for reaching remote areas with little to no manpower required. Because of this technology, our officers will have the information and quality data they need to make the best decision in any given situation. The press release accompanying the announcement indicated that, quote, The drone software uses bio readings to understand population patterns and allows quicker reaction time to ongoing events or potential health threats. The goal is to provide better health monitoring support for potential at-risk groups, including seniors, as well as for gathering crowds at beaches, train stations, parks, recreation areas, and shopping centers. The town went out of its way to assure that the program will not be used in individual yards, nor does it employ facial recognition technology. The panel, as it's been labeled, would be equipped with a specialized sensor and computer vision systems that can display fever, temperature, heart and respiratory rates, as well as detect people sneezing and coughing in crowds and wherever groups of people may work or congregate. In the words of Westport's first selectman, we know that social distancing is working to flatten the curve and ultimately saving lives. In an effort to continue safeguarding the citizens of Westport during the COVID-19 outbreak, and as we position ourselves to gradually return to our routines, we should explore ways to prevent a possible resurgence of the virus. I am proud, he said, of how Westport's first responders are handling COVID-19 and how the Westport Police Department, in particular, is committed to discovering smart solutions for current and future health emergencies. Sounds like a great plan, right? Reaction was swift. People were not happy with the concept of drones watching them, even if they were just standing in line outside the grocery store. David McGuire, executive director of the ACLU of Connecticut, described it as an example of, quote, privacy-invading companies using COVID-19 as a chance to market their products and create future business opportunities. Any new surveillance measures that isn't being advocated by public health professionals and restricted solely for public health use should be rejected, he said. This is about the kind of society we want to live in coming out of the coronavirus, he said. Do we want to live in a police state or a free society? It is crazy to see how much power the government is grabbing a hold of in such a short period of time. When the government uses drones to surveil its own people, you know we live in a police state. These sentiments echo a Wall Street Journal article that ran just a few days before, which quoted security professionals as saying, the coronavirus crisis could become a watershed moment similar to the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which ushered in new government surveillance powers around the world in the name of protecting public safety. On April 23rd, Port reversed itself. Just 2 days after implementing the program, they announced, in our good faith effort to get ahead of the virus and potential need to manage and safely monitor crowds and social distancing in this environment, our announcement was perhaps misinterpreted, not well received, and posed many additional questions. First Selectman Jim Marp said, we heard and respect your concerns and are therefore stepping back and reconsidering the full impact of the technology and its use in law enforcement protocol. So what happened? People are private. Ironically, the same people who willingly, indeed blithely, upload sensitive information to the internet, including GPS tracking information, have a knee-jerk reaction to the concept of a surveillance state. Even though people are uncomfortable with the amount of personal data they feel may be floating around out there about them in the cloud, on the internet, there is a sense that they volunteered to put the information out there. In fact, according to a Pew Research poll, although 97% of Americans have been asked to agree to a privacy policy, only 9% have actually read them. I would suggest that with cyberspace, there is nothing tangible to fear. Consider the fact that no one seems to complain about data flowing from their smartphones. Conversely, when you're talking about a drone, you have offending hardware right there in front of you to draw the ire and fear of individuals and crowds. And who can doubt the surveillance capability of drones? Who can doubt that the surveillance capability of drones is infinitely comprehensive and adaptive, able to record not only location information, but photograph, videotape, audio tape, use thermal imaging, engage facial recognition technology, and even intercept cell phone information. In short, drones are a visible platform for all things that make people nervous. There have been numerous articles about why people think drones are creepy. I suggest there are 3 primary reasons. First is the fact that people are generally uncomfortable with new technology. This is especially important because drones are a new technology in and of themselves. But on top of that, they are platforms for even more new technology, like infrared imaging. So you have a double whammy of lack of understanding and mistrust. The second reason is that the public has yet to separate civilian use from the much more notorious military use of drones. The military uses drones to spy and in some cases to destroy. And that is a characterization drones have yet to shake. Not to mention the fact that in today's world of clickbait, the media finds it much more enticing to talk about the rogue and illicit uses of drones, feeding on public undercurrents, than they are likely to highlight all the drones for good. And as a result, drones are perceived as a nuisance, something invasive that we want to keep out of our lives, and certainly out of our line of sight. Figuring out how to counter these knee-jerk reactions requires an understanding of the US public's relationship with privacy and government surveillance. So first, what is privacy? The dictionary says, privacy is the state or condition of being free from being observed or disturbed by other people. Privacy International says, privacy enables us to create barriers and manage boundaries to protect ourselves from unwarranted interference in our lives, which allows us to negotiate who we are and how we want to interact with the world around us. Privacy helps us establish boundaries to limit who has access to our bodies, places, and things, as well as our communications and our information. But I find this definition the most useful because it works better to encompass the concept of privacy. Privacy is control over knowledge about oneself, but it is not simply control over the quantity of information abroad. There are modulations in the quality of knowledge as well. We may not mind that a person knows a general fact about us, and yet feel our privacy invaded if he knows the details, if he or she knows the details, I should say. The important takeaway, privacy is a concept, and a very, very fluid one at that. There's no red line between what is private and what is not private. It can mean different things to different people, but above all, it is about power and control. Control over knowledge about oneself. That's a very important concept, control. When you think about privacy in terms of control, you understand the knee-jerk reaction to tangible hardware that is viewed as taking away that control. It's also important to understand modulation. Most people are okay with losing control over general facts, but not details. Our right to privacy flows from the common law. But, and this is important, even under the law, the concept of privacy, the rights it affords, is flexible. It is redefined from time to time as a result of social change and as a result of technological advancements. It's important to point out here again that although drones have their own unique characteristics, the technology they employ is largely an amalgamation of technology that has already been analyzed by the Supreme Court. Drones are simply new platforms for technologies like photography, thermal imaging, and so on. It's just that these technologies can be used more easily and flexibly on a drone. So when we talk about privacy rights and the Fourth Amendment protections, we are talking about what a drone has been fitted to do. In the United States, an individual's privacy from government surveillance and intervention is encapsulated in the Fourth Amendment, which states that the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. So that's our right. The government cannot survey individuals unless they have a warrant. Individuals in their homes, they can't survey and take their papers and effects unless they have a warrant. So privacy rights, even as protected by the Fourth Amendment, are continuously evolving as technology evolves. And since the beginning of the 20th century, the Supreme Court has struggled to find the balance between that technological advancement and individual privacy interests. Think about it. Look at the wording of the amendment. Does personhood extend to someone's phone? Does a house include a backyard? Do papers and effects include emails and text messages? And the crux of everything, what is unreasonable? Up until 1967, the Supreme Court had held that you needed to physically intrude on a person or that person's home in order for a search or surveillance to be unreasonable. That means you actually had to physically enter the home, like putting a bug in a lamp, or the person placing a device in someone's pocket. The concept of privacy was wrapped around the concept of a person's home. Think that the person's home is their castle and their body inviolate. Cats changed that. Acting on a suspicion that an individual, here Cats, was transmitting gambling information over the phone to clients in other states, attached an eavesdropping device to the outside of a public phone booth regularly used by Cats. The outside of a public phone booth. Based on the recordings of his end of the conversation, Cats was convicted of illegally transmitting wagering information, gambling. Cats appealed his conviction, stating that putting a device outside of a public phone booth was an illegal search and seizure, essentially illegal surveillance. Under prior court decisions, Cats would have lost because neither he himself, nor his home, nor anything he owned was violated. The court in Cats was not happy with this result and, instead, ruled that a violation of the Fourth Amendment depended upon whether the information gathered had been knowingly exposed to the public. In other words, did Cats have a reasonable expectation that his information would be private? And it's important to point out all the cases that I'm discussing today are from the Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, so the highest level in the United States. So here you have Cats in a phone booth, something he could shut and exclude the public from. As such, he created a bubble where he had a reasonable expectation of privacy. As you can see, though, from the slide, the Cats test rests not simply on what subjectively the person thought. That would be silly, right? Because I could think I have privacy expectation over every aspect of my life. But what society is prepared to recognize as a reasonable expectation. The second part of the test demonstrates the fluidity of the concept of privacy. It is always going to change based on what society recognizes. Although the Cats court used the word reasonable, later court decisions substitute the word legitimate. So today, the question is, what would society be prepared to recognize as a legitimate expectation of privacy? We don't have phone booths anymore, or not many anyway, but you can imagine if a government agent standing close to a suspect talking on a cell phone overhears incriminating evidence or incriminating conversation, or if a listening device were left on a building corner, it would be much harder to argue a legitimate expectation of privacy in that conversation. As we think about the evolving concept of a legitimate expectation of privacy, I will walk you through what has been called the aerial surveillance trilogy, cases involving aerial, although not drone, surveillance. Most of you likely know that in all three of these cases, the Supreme Court found that evidence gathered by law enforcement through aerial surveillance without a warrant did not violate the Fourth Amendment. In California v. Cirillo, the police obtained a tip that the defendant was growing marijuana in his backyard. The yard was surrounded by two fences and could not be seen from the street. So the police used an airplane to fly over the property. Using only their eyes, not enhanced with binoculars or telescoping devices, the police saw marijuana growing in the yard and took pictures of it with a standard 35mm camera. So think about that. Cirillo put a fence around his yard, presumably for the purpose of keeping whatever he was doing in his backyard private. Reasonable expectation of privacy, right? Certainly, it would have been illegal for the police to simply hop over the fence and look. Doesn't he have a reasonable or legitimate expectation of privacy? No. The court found that it was unreasonable to expect privacy from surveillance that took place within the navigable airspace above the property, given that any member of the public flying in the airspace who glanced down could have seen everything that the police observed. In other words, society was not prepared to recognize that Cats had a legitimate expectation of privacy vis-à-vis airplanes in navigable airspace. His rights were not intruded upon. So you cannot get privacy from any open to public traffic. Dow Chemical was an EPA case. Dow Chemical barred public view of its property from the ground, much like Serralo. So the EPA hired a commercial aerial photographer to photograph the plant with a special aerial mapping camera. As you can imagine, this is so much like Serralo. However, the court did not focus here on physical intrusiveness. Instead, it focused on the type of technology being used. Had the EPA used a 35mm camera, the case would have been essentially identical. But here, EPA used a specialized camera. Ultimately, the court found this was acceptable because the camera was commonly used in map making. However, the court did indicate that using highly sophisticated surveillance equipment not generally available to the public, such as satellite technology or an electronic device to penetrate walls or windows, may be unconstitutional. So even if you establish that you are in a public area, like public airspace, your defendant still has reasonable and legitimate expectations of privacy that only common technology is being used. The courts will look to see if the technology is generally available to the public. In other words, can you buy it at Walmart? You do not have a legitimate expectation of privacy against commonly used technology. Finally, Florida v. Riley involved a helicopter flying over the defendant's home to discover he was growing marijuana. Following Serralo, the court determined it made no difference if the aerial vehicle was a fixed-wing one or not. Here, the court, however, offered another way to consider the concept of privacy by looking at the intrusiveness of the surveillance. Because flying a helicopter over the home did not disturb the defendant's use of his own property, it is considered that the defendant did not have a reasonable expectation of privacy in this regard. So think about the evolving concept of privacy. If someone can see from navigable airspace without causing too much intrusion and using common technology, you do not have a legitimate expectation of privacy. Because thermal imaging is one of the technologies utilized by the so-called pandemic drones, I thought it would be useful to mention Kilo v. US, where the Supreme Court held that the police use of thermal imaging technology to detect whether marijuana was being grown inside a home was considered a violation of a reasonable expectation of privacy and a violation of the Fourth Amendment. The court questioned what limits are there upon the power of technology to shrink the realm of guaranteed privacy, and answered the question using the Dow chemical test. Here, in 2001, thermal imaging scanners were not in general public use. Justice Scalia, writing for the majority, said, "Whereas here, the government uses a device that is not in general public use to explore details of the home that would previously have been unknowable without physical intrusion, the surveillance is a search and is presumptively unreasonable without a warrant." In dissent, Justice John Paul Stevens argued that the observations were made with a fairly primitive thermal imager that gathered data exposed on the outside of Kilo's home, but did not invade any constitutionally protected interest in privacy, and were thus information in the public domain. So arguably, this case would be decided differently today, 18 years later, because thermal imaging technology can be bought at Walmart. And so we've lost this legitimate or reasonable expectation of privacy that our home won't be thermally imaged. Finally, US v. Jones discussed the constitutionality of attaching a GPS tracker to an individual's car to monitor the car's movement. The court here found that people do have a reasonable expectation of privacy in the movements of their vehicles. But I bring this to your attention because of the concurring opinion of Justice Sotomayor, who I think poses two questions that we need to answer that pertain directly to drone use. First, should people reasonably expect that their movements will be recorded and aggregated in a manner that enables the government to ascertain, more or less at will, their political and religious beliefs, sexual habits, and so on? Jones talked about vehicle movements, Here, we are talking about social distance trackers, individual movements. And second, how do we counter the concern that awareness that the government may be watching chills associational and expressive freedoms, and the government's unrestrained power to assemble data that reveal private aspects of identity is susceptible to abuse? In other words, will social distancing drones chill association and expressive freedom, and will data obtained be abused? Arguably, today, we want drones to chill association. So the evolution of the concept of privacy is completely turned on its head. So what did this jaunt through Fourth Amendment jurisprudence tell us? That the concept, first of all, when talking about the utilization of pandemic drones, the law is probably on your side, so long as surveillance is always in a public place. Certainly, being watched by a drone in a public place is no more intrusive than a security camera or a traffic light camera for that matter. While there is yet to be any Supreme Court jurisprudence regarding what might be a reasonable altitude for a flight, so long as the drones remain focused on the public domain, it is not reasonable to expect privacy. Moreover, thermal imaging technology is much more accessible than it was in 2001, suggesting per the Supreme Court's test that it is no longer reasonable to expect that it is not being employed. But having the law on your side isn't going to change what happened in Westport. That said, understanding the law offers lessons and guides as to how society might be able to overcome its distrust of drones. So how do we reduce the stigma? Well, the first thing we can do is partner with public health officials. Even the ACLU agrees with that. Remember, the head of the ACLU Connecticut said these drones cannot be accepted unless they have been endorsed by public health officials and used in a manner as guided by public health officials. So drone operators and companies can't just offer these solutions. They need to work with public health officials to determine whether those solutions really will have an effect. For example, this particular attorney suggested that the thermal imaging and the suggestion that these cameras could detect a fever or a cough was irrelevant because we wouldn't know if that is actually COVID. Moreover, a lot of people carrying COVID are asymptomatic. So having a drone that is able to determine a fever is not going to help in the battle against COVID. So if we want to use drones in the battle against COVID, in pandemics, in other situations like this, we have to make sure we are working with public health officials to determine what is best and what is effective. And that even also means pilot programs or test programs. Again, if it's a test program that a public health official supports, then this will help ease the acceptance of it. And again, even the ACLU agrees. If you get the public health officials on board, then it might be okay. I want to draw attention to more invasive strategies of tracking, and work to assure that you, the drone operator, the drone system, the drone solution, is being the least intrusive and invasive as possible. So some countries are considering using phone data to track COVID. If you download an app on your phone, or if you are forced to download an app on your phone, then the phone can track wherever you've been and will tell you if you've been next door to somebody or sat down on a bench next to somebody who might later have COVID. Now, I asked my students in my class, would you download this app that would track all of your positions so that you would know if you sat down next to somebody with COVID? And 201, every student in my class said absolutely not. Using drones to track people or to follow people or to monitor social distancing is a much less invasive strategy than using phone data tracking. The Constitution is on your side, so work within it. Stay within the constitutional bounds. Read all of Sotomayor's opinions. She has a lot to say about privacy and trying to understand what privacy means in this age of technology. She has very thoughtful concepts about GPS and what we put on a phone and how, we no longer have paper journals, but all of our information is up on this cloud. Most of these are related to cybersecurity cases, but again, it's the same concept, this concept of privacy in the 21st century. what does it mean? We have to get people comfortable with what they are losing control of. Acknowledge that technology moves faster than the law, so self-police. The drone industry should get together and acknowledge and understand what people are afraid of. Use in public, draw lines for the public. Use words like control and general information. Nobody's losing control of their information or of their details. The drone technology is being used in a way that respects people's details and respects people's control over themselves. Publicize more drones for good. We can counter the media and make more and more public and people more aware of all of the great things that drones do. Coming out of this pandemic, as people who are into drones, I mean, I think I see in my Twitter feed probably 5 or 6 tweets a day with some new innovative way drones have made somebody's life easier. That needs to get out to the public more. We have to look at drones and not be afraid of them as some robotic AI, but as things that will help us have better lives. And that falls into also public education on responsible drone use. So industries are often blamed for the acts of one bad actor. So everybody who operates a drone should be publicly educated about how to use that drone, and not just the FAA drone licensing, but we ought to, as an industry, have sort of self-certifications. I am a responsible drone user, and I will not do these certain things. I won't take random pictures in public. We need to make the public more aware of the technology. This is baby steps. In 2001, thermal imaging was unheard of. In 2019, you can buy it at Walmart. So people need to be eased into this transition. And finally, the most important thing with respect to anything about data, about drone use, is cybersecurity measures. The biggest fear everybody will have, or the biggest fear that the ACLU will point out, other than being accepting of this surveillance state, is this concept that your data is out there. There's a picture of me out there, and what's going to happen to that picture if you're hacked? So it's all about that data, and the drone industry can take the lead in having transparent cybersecurity measures and certifications to help people comfortable in the knowledge that perhaps there's a drone there helping with social distancing, but I know that it will take this picture and then dispose of it. And finally, I forgot to put this bullet up, but we need to stress more how much it helps. The drones are an extra pair of eyes, an extra body for healthcare providers and for police personnel. They're not doing anything more than what a person could do. And so you're protecting people, you're protecting our public health personnel, or protecting policemen by not sending them into the crowds with COVID concerns, and allowing our police and the people who protect us to take measures to protect themselves. So before I conclude and open for questions, I just want to thank my team at the University of Mississippi, 4 incredible students, Nestor Delgado, Laura Brady, Capel Gray, and Matthew Russ. Our full analysis of this concept of privacy and how to harness the pandemic to realize all of the benefits of drones is going to be available as part of our inaugural issue of the Drone Law and Policy Journal, which will be available in early September. It will be digital, so please email me at mlhanlon@olemiss.edu if you would like a copy. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michelle. That was really informative. We're going to jump in now to just a couple of questions that have come in from the audience. The first one is just someone asking about clarification around the messaging, if any, that citizens received during the drone temperature check in Westport.
So it was a press release that was released by the town of Westport, and it was picked up by the media. So it came out on local TV that evening, NBC and CBS, I think, locally. And again, this is the media did not focus on, hey, this is a great idea. It focused on, oh, they're going to take your temperature from the air. And so there is part of the Westport story There is a gentleman in Westport who's kind of a privacy rabble-rouser, if you will, and he is notorious for taking a stand against the town. And so he's actually the one who rallied the people to go and put up those, signs about surveillance state and so forth. So arguably, if it hadn't been Westport, if he hadn't been there, I think the press release was poorly worded because it gave the media the opportunity to read too much into what was happening. I think if it had been much more of a, we're thinking of testing this, or, we're focused on social distancing instead of on the infrared technology, I think it would have had better success.
Sure. So it sounds like there are a couple factors there, and maybe the communication could have been clearer and more effective.
Exactly.
We've got another one here. Someone asking if there are parallels to taking photos on public property and the use of drones to take photos.
So I think my sense would be, okay, so if you are in a park or in a stadium and you're taking pictures of the crowds, yes, you're allowed to do that. You're in a public place, and a person who has their picture taken does not have a reasonable expectation of privacy in that regard. There would be no difference with the drone, absolutely not, because as long as the drone is licensed to fly, or has been given permission, you can't just, there are rules about flying over crowds. Many states don't even allow it. So long as the drone is legally in a place it's allowed to be, then that drone can take pictures of the crowds. Now, of course, you're going to have different issues. If you publish those pictures, you might get people who are worried about different kinds of rights, First Amendment, their own, but that's a different legal path. But yeah, if your drone is someplace where it's allowed to be in a public place and it's taking pictures, then it would be the same as you taking pictures from the ground. Got it.
We have someone asking here if you would recommend applying the recommendations that you just went through to recreational flyers or formalized groups of recreational flyers.
Absolutely. I think when we're talking about the community, it's still small enough right now that everybody has a role to play in terms of public education and public trust. And so I think if recreational drone operators are read into these kinds of concepts and are able to talk to their neighbors about it. So when somebody says to somebody else, oh, the pesky drone was flying over my yard, then you can say, well, and explain, well, that's not right. And, a responsible drone operator wouldn't do that. But I think it's really important to get the message out completely to everybody. And responsible drone operators would have also the responsibility to call out people who aren't acting responsibly, even recreationally, with their drone.
Sure, absolutely. Let's see. Someone asked if how you see remote. You had mentioned at one point cybersecurity being a factor and sort of like things to grasp onto, and how does remote ID kind of play into that?
So the remote ID is interesting because we're actually, one of the articles we're doing is whether the remote ID is legal, from looking at it from the other way, from the privacy of the drone operator. Mm-hmm. Do you have a right to know where that person's drone is going all the time? But cybersecurity sort of underlies, I think, every facet of our lives right now, right? I mean, it's just the amount of times I think another Pew Research showed that like 90% of adults in the past year have gotten a credit card, statement that said, oh, we lost your data, right? So that's an incredible number. And so the public's become inured to this, oh, well, my credit card, Marriott was hacked. So I think that they're inured to big Marriott getting hacked, but they're not inured to a drone getting hacked yet. And so it's vital, again, that we take, from a public safety, but also from a personal standpoint, that you take every measure possible to protect your data and any remote access or, ability to change those kinds of IDs. Cybersecurity is really going to be the backbone of our future with respect to technology.
Sure. No, it's definitely very all-encompassing. Someone asked, who has the authority to enforce regulations related to drones? Is it state or federal?
State. Right now, you get licensed through the FAA, and this is actually part of the problem, again, with respect to drones and the public trust of drones. We have a piecemeal regulation at a state-by-state level. Every state has different rules. Some states have rules about privacy in drones. Some states say, oh, if you have if you have a drone, you have to follow all of our privacy rules. Some states have actual different privacy rules for drones. And so, I mean, for a drone operator, it's a headache if you cross state lines. But for people, there's no uniformity with respect to how drone operators have to act. But definitely it is a state level regulation and state level enforcement. And actually, again, one of our students has done a paper which suggests language that states ought to pass to give people comfort about their privacy with respect to drones. And we hope it's something that the drone industry will get behind as well, because it explains, it makes clear, people think, oh, it's a drone, don't survey me. When in actuality, it's nothing more than technology that we've all seen. It's just on a different platform. So the working towards uniformity of drone regulation is also a key to sort of building public trust.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. I think we have time for one more question. Someone asked if law enforcement should be required to inform the public of drone use before it happens, and do you think that would increase public trust? So
I think that's it. I'm going to answer it in two parts. First, if you are going to a stadium or to a park or to an outdoor concert, and the law enforcement is going to use drones as part of their crowd control, whether it's social distancing or just simply crowd control, absolutely. I think that the police ought to announce that that's how they're going to be surveying a particular crowd, in addition to having boots on the ground or security on the ground. They're also going to use this measure to protect the public. Should there be an understanding, and there's a lot of concern in the wake of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movements, protests, the concern that police are using drones to monitor the protests. Well, you're not going to tell. I think the protesters, any protester would have to assume that they are going to be using whatever kind of crowd control they can. Would it help if the police announced, yes, you can have your protest, but we will be using drones? Absolutely. I think that would be, again, a great help. It should become part of, and perhaps for community liaison, just part of the understanding. And maybe we get to the point where people understand there will be drones unless the police say they're not. And the only thing, I bifurcate it because certainly there are opportunities for the police to use drones in exigent circumstances against certain crimes. And of course, you don't want to warn the public of those situations. So.
Sure, no, it makes sense that it's kind of a nuanced approach, and it can't just do one broad level should for police officers. Great. Well, I think that's our time. Thank you so much for presenting. As a reminder, the presentation will be available within about an hour using the URL that you used to log in initially. Thanks to Michelle for joining us today, and we hope to see you all very soon.
Thank you so much.